Hello, hi Steve.
Hi, Dave. How you doing?
Good. Been better, but good. That was a fun technical. Uh,
Couple of hours,
yeah, that was good.
indeed.
Listen, we're all here. It looks like people have gotten the message
Great,
on the other webinar, so we've got a really
fantastic.
good turnout.
Big
So,
apologies, everyone.
guys, thank you very much for your patience. We started a few minutes later, but we won't keep you. My name is Dave Kay. I am the CEO at Peak Content, and I am going to be introducing Steve. For many of you, he needs no introduction, but I'll be introducing him. I'll be looking at the questions as we go through, and at the end, also setting some of the questions live to Steve. I've also been involved in this project generating video content for this, which has been used as primary research material. And we've got some beautiful films to go alongside this webinar. However, in the interest of time and the fact we're starting late, we'll be sending links around for those so you can have a look at them afterwards. So please do check them out. You'll hear the all from the source, so to speak, some of the stuff that Steve will be talking through. So that will be coming on to you later. In terms of Steve, well, the man, the legend himself, I'm sure a lot of you know him, but for those of you who don't, Steve's the founder of The Outsiders, which is a cultural insight agency, and The Outsiders specialize in culture, communication insights, and I've known Steve throughout my whole research career and always been impressed by the breadth and wealth of his experience. But he's done lots of work around understanding womanhood in Russia, Middle East, loads of stuff around diversity in America and China, the rise of selfie culture as well. Here in the UK, huge amount of work around Brexit, and was one of the few people that predicted Brexit and knew that it was coming. A huge amount of political work, but also stuff around the crumbling, the death of conservatism in America, the crumbling of the Red Wall here in the UK when it comes to politics. And a lot of work around toxic masculinity and essentially understanding the mass mainstream, the sort of working class voices. As I mentioned earlier, he's the founder of the Outsiders, the cultural insight agency, and he himself describes himself as the archetypical outsider being both physically disabled and working class. An absolute master of his art, often compared to Louis Theroux, which I think is a deep compliment. I will hand over to him right now to take us through some really fascinating work. I'll be on the chat if you have any questions. And as I say, some of the videos from the webinar today will be shared with you so you can enjoy them at your leisure. So, Steve, over to you.
Welcome, everyone. So I'm Stephen Lacey, and thank you for a wonderful introduction. And sorry about the technical problems today. So today we're going to talk about coronavirus, the age of rage, and the battle of trust. And it's quite a difficult subject in some issues, and I think it might be quite impactful. But when I set up the Outsiders, part of the Outsiders is I wanted to give voices to many different kinds of people and to really relay their voice, because I think you can't hide voices and what's happening. And I think we're in one of the most uncertain times ever. So what we're going to go through is very quickly over the objectives and methodology. And then I'm going to talk to you about the mass mainstream, some of their kind of common codes. I'm going to talk to you how they feel a world with coronavirus, some views on the government, trust in media, the rise of conspiracy theories, some views on Black Lives Matter and what they think, and then some general thoughts about what I think needs to happen with this kind of audience. And I've chosen the word thoughts rather than conclusions, because I think it's very open to kind of debate. So objectives. So our objective was really to understand who they are, what their values, how's coronavirus been impacted on their lives, what's their levels of trust in media and science, the rise of conspiracy theories, response to kind of government policies and views of the opposition party, and views on Black Lives Matter. And the audience we've chosen is at a C1, C2 with some D in it. It's defined by the Policy Exchange as just managing audience. And one of the interesting things in terms of marketing is we often go ABC1 and we go C2, D, E. We often ignore the kind of middle, and this is that 50% in the middle, not necessarily poor, but they're not rich. Often the kind of adds to the mum, that adds the kind of shopper driving a kind of mainstream kind of car. They're important, and there's a number of reasons why they're important. They're most companies target audience, most companies audience. So you'll see them in your shops or kind of buying your goods. They also hold the keys to power in many ways. So this is the audience in many ways that represented that red wall that kind of crumbled. And political strategists, I would argue, have really kind of understood this audience. Since the policy exchange 2015, the Conservative strategists have really been kind of studying and understanding that these are the kind of key makers. Labour's kind of catching up. They've got Claire Ainsley in, who's working for Keir Starmer, who wrote the book, The New Working Class. So they're really, really kind of important audience, and often they're kind of ignored. And I remember hearing about the Democratic Party in Denmark, and they're one of the first social democratic parties for many years to have power, and they targeted this kind of mass mainstream audience, and they said, you didn't leave us, we left you. And I think in many ways that's very true for the advertising industry as well. I think there's a big kind of disconnect between the advertising industry and marketing and this mass mainstream kind of audience, and there's been some fantastic work done in this by the guys at House 51 and Reach as well. So this is the second COVID presentation I did. The first one was just at the beginning of the kind of process, a whole range of different kind of ages. We have a mix of kind of men and women and a range of different kind of locations, many kind of in the north, but also we chose Feltham in Greater London, because one of the things we find is that the white mass mainstream, that there's this kind of illusion they don't kind of exist in London. But if you go to places like Feltham or Mitcham, you will see this audience. So what did we do? So we did 32 one-hour Skype chats and 20 15-minute Facebook chats and a number of kind of video diaries as well. We've been tracking since the election some Conservative voters, first-time Conservative voters from the north, to measure their attitudes and any political fallout. We also just did some video diaries with 6 mass mainstreams, which Peak and Dave helped, and you'll see the videos later. So I'm going to talk to you about some of their kind of common kind of codes. I think in many ways we look for kind of differences, but I think let's look at kind of commonalities and what kind of unifies this kind of audience. And I think it's really, really important. I use the word common codes. You could use the word mindsets, because in many ways mindsets is just the establishment of this kind of identity that this audience has. So one of the first things I say is they're not future orientated. So I've seen this for a number of years. I call it a kind of the death of kind of dreams. They're not thinking very much in terms of the future. They don't have aspirations in the sense that in 2 years I'm going to do this, in 3 years I'm going to do that. Part of that reason is the present can be very, very difficult, even to the ones that are kind of a bit wealthier in this kind of audience. So often they're in survival mode, and they're really kind of focusing on the present and in many ways the kind of immediate gratification of the now. And part of that reason is because they don't have much mental availability to think beyond that. However, since the crash, things have become very kind of difficult for this kind of audience. So they're looking back very much to kind of the past and that sense of kind of nostalgia. And why do they do that? It's, well, the past provides security and the past provides kind of positive kind of memories. And I think as times get more difficult, this audience will always look back to the past because it will give them a sense of kind of protection and a sense of kind of security. So often you'll see them shift into the terrain of the familiarity and also the kind of rise of kind of nostalgia kind of brands. They endorse Britishness and Englishness. It's really interesting. I did a big kind of project looking at kind of Britishness and what does it kind of mean. And for this audience, it means everything. For those that are more of the kind of global kind of citizen on the other side, it means much less. But for these, Britishness makes them feel safe and secure. It's familiar and it's nostalgic, and they're very, very proud of that sense of identity and that sense of British or English kind of identity. It's security and its strength and kind of power of the past, which they like, and it's very kind of romantic notions. And some people always say to me, what is that part of the past that they really kind of identify with? And I think it's really hard to say in a specific kind of time, but I always say it best represents a kind of Hovis kind of advert, that time of the kind of rural community when it's community life and everyone kind of got on and everyone was kind of kind. But Britishness is really, really important. And I love this quote from a behavioural change expert that I spoke to, who said, I think Britishness is such a secure anchor in their lives because it's something you can't take away from somebody. You can take away opportunity, you can take away a voice and people, but the Britishness, it's their identity. You can't take that away. So that's really, really important. This is an audience that often can lose things and has that kind of loss, but there's a sense that Britishness is the one thing in their life that can't be kind of taken away. Distrust. I mean, they're highly cynical, and there's very, very few things that they trust, essentially because they've been constantly kind of let down. They trust the NHS, they trust the armed forces, and they trust the royal family. They distrust kind of politicians. Not this government's a little bit kind of different, but we'll come to that later. They distrust the local councillors, and they distrust kind of business leaders, those kind of fat cats that have kind of don't live in the kind of real world, often live in islands many, many miles away, don't pay tax. Communication, I think this is a really, really important kind of point. They don't pontificate. I think this is the difference between this audience and a more middle class audience. They don't sit there and think, what is the meaning of an advert? What is the deep meaning of media? What is the deep meaning of kind of politics? Essentially because they don't have time, they don't have mental availability. What they like is they like directness and authenticity. Horrible word and means different things to many different kind of people. But for this audience, it's about being kind of straight talking and being kind of direct. They accept arguing. So I remember doing groups in someone's house, and I was interviewing a couple, and suddenly they just exploded into the biggest kind of argument with each other. But they kind of blew up and then very, very quickly kind of calmed down. Things need to be very, very kind of functional and visual. So people learn in many different kind of ways. Some people learn kinesthetically, some people learn by writing, some people learn kind of visually. This audience learn kinesthetically by doing and repetition, and also by kind of visual. Storytelling, they love stories. They love telling stories of the past. They tell stories about their great grandfather who won £30,000 at Kempton at the races. Short form content, bite-sized content works very, very well, and they laugh to kind of survive. So they like to laugh at others because it makes them feel better, but also to laugh at themselves, because sometimes life can be difficult and very, very dark. And they respect strength, and I think this is really, really important. They like leaders that are very, very kind of strong and take kind of strong kind of decisions. And I think the other thing is that the propositions that really kind of work with this is the very, very simple things like let's take back control would be a classic one, or get Brexit done. So things where they don't have to pontificate deeply about the kind of meaning. They want respect, and I think this is really, really important. This audience in many ways is I would class as the white working class audience, and this was an audience that was always respectful. This was the backbone of the kind of nation. These were the shipbuilders, these were the miners, these were the shopkeepers. They always had respect, and then over time that respect has kind of dissipated, but they want it back. And whether they're kind of a young person who wants respect from his kind of peers, through to an old person who's brought up with those kind of values that you should always respect others. Respect is key. One of the other big areas that's really, really important is fairness. And I think this is a dimension that really kind of unifies this, and is probably one of the primary drivers for this audience. They want fairness, and they want to be treated well, and they want to be treated fairly. And there's a feeling that they've been kind of left behind. There's a feeling that they're the backbone of the nation, but people don't really care about them. Feeling that they've often been kind of treated with contempt. So just a few more kind of codes. So they're socially conservative, often believe in kind of, for instance, kind of could be kind of pro hanging, but they want to be hard on kind of criminals. And for a little while, Priti Patel was kind of playing the sounds of this kind of audience. They tend to dislike political kind of correctness. They're not against diversity, so to speak, but they don't like political correctness because they feel like it's someone else telling them what to do. They talk a lot about they have to have different identities, one at home with their friends and a different one at kind of work, and they don't like that, and they feel the ability to say what you want to say has been closed down. I kind of call it liberal totalitarianism. They like banter, and I remember doing diversity training with some guys from factory kind of workers, and we were talking about the dangers of banter, and they really kind of struggle with it. And I see this when I was growing up with working class kind of communities and mass mainstream kind of communities. You walk into the pub, even myself, I'd be called Crazy Legs, and I've got 2 toes, I'd be called Terry Two Toes, and I'd be called Penguin. And this was beef from my best friends. But it's kind of this object that you kind of strip each other bare by calling each other names and make each other vulnerable, and then you really kind of bond. Locally kind of minded, so they're very locally for 3 generations. Most haven't gone more than kind of 5 miles. There's a lot of talk around kind of elites. They don't mind the upper class, and I would argue on the whole they tend to kind of like the upper class, and there's a deference to them, which is why they like programs such as kind of Downton Abbey, and they like the Queen. What they really dislike is the middle class. And I remember doing some stereotype works, and every group we put words of different audiences in front of this audience and said, what's the stereotypes? And the upper class were like, they're mad, they're crazy, they do drugs, they're debauched, they're wild. We then put middle class, and the room just went quiet, and people just said they're just boring. But there's a feeling that the middle class kind of look down on them, and they don't like that sense of being kind of judged. And they can feel judged, and we'll talk more about this later on. Life can be really, really difficult, so they want little rays of sunshine in their lives. So whether that's a bottle of wine or a chocolate bar, just to brighten their day. They like symbols of luxury, so status symbols are really, really important. It's very hard for people to move up class these days, so you tend to show your success by badges. So keeping up with the Joneses and showing different kind of badges. So whether that's driving a better kind of car, or having a better kind of TV, or better kind of labels on kind of clothes. They like to be surprised, and they appreciate that. They're very kind of fatalistic. So there's a sense that we kind of roll with the good times, and we also kind of have the kind of bad times. And they're savvy shoppers. And I don't know if anyone's done shopping with these audiences, but they know the kind of prices of everything. So a world with coronavirus. So what's happening with kind of coronavirus? How's it kind of impacting on this kind of audience? We see this saying, we're kind of all in it together. And this audience kind of like the sentiment. It kind of suggests togetherness. It feels that we're kind of united in difficult times. This audience tends to be much more kind of collectivist and interdependent. So it appeals to that kind of sense of we're in it kind of together, that collectiveness. Has a wartime feel, roll up your sleeves, and it kind of makes them feel kind of safe. But it no longer feels kind of true. And as kind of COVID's kind of gone on, you've seen the belief in this statement kind of drop further and further down. They know some people are much more kind of vulnerable. They know people that have lost their jobs. There's some that have been very, very busy. They know people that have been suffering from mental health kind of issues because they've been kind of stuck at home. They know people who've got the no gardens with the kids in the kind of flats versus others with the gardens. They know that some people have been furloughed and are doing extra jobs, so they're better off than they've ever been, and also the mortgage break, where others are kind of poorer. They know some people have the ability to educate their children well at home. For others, it's really, really difficult if you haven't got that high kind of degree of literacy or numeracy kind of skills. Can really kind of impact on your kind of confidence. And the facts support this. So Black people are 4.2 times more likely to die from COVID. There's more kind of sexual abuse of kind of children as the school can't intervene. Children are being brought up by kind of single parents. 75% of children at private schools, when they're having their online kind of lessons, can speak in class, 5-6% in state. So the evidence is there that we're not in this altogether. So there is a number of kind of common codes that are kind of occurring during kind of lockdown. I think one of the first things is the lack of kind of protective network. So with the pubs not being open, with the cafes not being open, these are the protective networks, especially for men, where they can find out about jobs. If you're a tradesman, you can find out kind of information about things that are kind of happening. So they've kind of not been there. So the world's gotten very much smaller. And also this audience is an audience that heavily relies on their family, but often they can't see their family at the moment. So it's got smaller and smaller. So they're in very, very small kind of worlds. The size of these don't make the importance, by the way. they're missing gossip. And I thought this was an interesting one. This was an observation a woman in her 50s said. She said, one of the big things I'm missing about COVID is gossip. And this is an audience that is very much collectivist. They often live inside each other's houses. There's very, very tight friendship groups. Everyone kind of knows each other. But part of that is everyone kind of talks about each other. And sometimes it can feel like being in the scene of kind of EastEnders. And it kind of makes people feel good. It allows people to find out how people are doing so they can support them. But it's part of their kind of lifestyle. And the next one's ninja shopping, which is an interesting one, because this is how I've shopped. So in a way, I'm quite pleased about this, because I'm disabled, and being disabled, shopping is incredibly difficult. So I always have to think about my transport. I always have to think about how busy a store is. I always have to go in with a list. I have to look for a parking space. And essentially, this is how people are shopping now. So they're going in with a list, hit and run, very little kind of spontaneous kind of shopping, get in and kind of out. We're seeing with COVID a pullback to the familiar. So a lot of familiar music coming back into play, people playing familiar games, people making recipes that their gran used to kind of cook. We're having a lack of show and tell. And by that, I mean on Facebook. So one of the things I've really noticed, because we were looking at people's Facebook posts, and people suddenly just dropped out of kind of Facebook. I think part of that reason was because people didn't have interesting stories to tell about the pubs they've been to, or the clubs they've been to, or the holiday they've had. So where the world has suddenly kind of got smaller, that show and tell is not so prominent. Connection with nature. So a lot of people are talking about being out with their kind of being out with the countryside, doing kind of walks, the clean air. They're talking about noticing the kind of clean air. Rise of fantasy. Always when we have dark times, we have a rise of kind of fantasy. Just always kind of happens. So you see the rise of superheroes and just that sense of kind of imagination. The magnification of the mundane. So the mundane suddenly becomes really, really interesting in COVID, where the world kind of gets smaller. So you start having arguments about not having any butter, or not having kind of any milk, or you might even laugh about not having any milk. And if you're writing an email to someone, where people used to say to people, how was your weekend? And they say, fine. Now you get 3 pages. And the same was in discussions. People, when they're on the phone or on Zoom, they struggle to know what to talk about. But when they do talk, they more or less break their day by kind of day part. Rise of working class hero. This is something I'm really, really kind of pleased about, because especially in the music field, I think there's been a lack of working class heroes for ages. And I'd argue the last white working class hero was kind of Oasis. But the key workers, the rise of key workers is really, really important. Experimental kind of conservatism. So on one hand, people being very conservative in their kind of values, but they are starting to experiment. So I was talking to men who for the first time started kind of cooking. You're seeing women using kind of doing kind of needlework or kind of tapestry, or things they've never usually kind of done, or they might have done very many years ago with their kind of grandparents. The rise of community, and this is something this audience has wanted for so long. You're seeing people start to know their kind of neighbour again, having conversations with their neighbour. The Facebook community groups have been really, really kind of supportive. Rebellion, really important point. This audience does not like revolution. This audience does not like fast change. Fast change always hurts the mass mainstream, and fast change hurts the people below the mass mainstream as well. But what you are seeing is you're seeing conformist rebellion. So you'll see people using graffiti in Cornwall saying, second homers, please don't come to my town. So it's rebellion, but in the sense of kind of conformity. Frugality, we're starting to see a little bit of the return of frugality. How that will play out will be kind of interesting to kind of see, but some people are realizing that they don't need as much things as they thought, and it can take them back very much to the kind of past when things were kind of good and things were safe. And my gran used to just only have kind of one telly, and we used to use the same kind of water, and we used to grow things. The return of dreams, and I think this is important. As I said before, this is an audience that hasn't dreamed again, but I think COVID's made people stop and think. So they're starting to think about what's my future and what's my future kind of direction. This is from The Economist, and it's definitely true. So you're seeing the future and the past kind of collide. So you're seeing this audience more or less move back to 1950s kind of representation, where it's very, very traditional. The women are looking after the children, doing cooking, doing kind of the needlework, looking after the house. So you've got this kind of 1950s, more or less Stepford wife on one hand, and then on the other, you've kind of got virtual kind of horse racing, kind of Kempton and TikTok. The last one was just from a discussion that I had. He wasn't actually mass mainstream. It's my film guy, Daniel, but I think it applies to someone. I just love this as an insight. Old before my years. And he says that he's a 30-year guy in his kind of 30s, and he feels that because of COVID, he's like retired in his 70s and can't go out, and he's living with his girlfriend during this kind of period. So it just feels like you're old before your kind of years. A few other things. So they're admiring celebrities who are on their side. So Rashford coming out very, very positively. Really, really well done. And I like this because a lot of people talk about the far right of this audience, but this was on someone's Facebook post, and a lot of people saying this is great, telling Kate Hopkins basically to F off. They admire the celebrities on their side. So Joe Wicks has been great with his exercise. Tyson Fury has been great with his exercise. Ronaldo, there's a whole thing about what he's done and how much he's given to charity. Oasis, we're talking about putting on concerts. Rihanna for giving away money. Williams for releasing books. But some celebrities are criticised, and we talked about this kind of last time. But Richard Branson really, really disliked. Victoria Beckham, because of what she did with Furlough, disliked. Some others that come up is Carl Walker and also kind of Gordon Ramsay, because feeling they kind of broke the lockdown, which was a disgrace. They're turning off combative kind of celebrities. I think this is a really important thing. So you're seeing a lot about Piers Morgan. I used to like him. I don't like him anymore. It doesn't feel appropriate to be so kind of aggressive. He's over the top. He's a bully. It's just not the right kind of time. And when LBC sacked Farage, I thought I was going to see an outpour around this, and I didn't. In fact, when I spoke to people, they said, I think it's a good thing because Farage is a bit of a kind of firebrand. And I think one of the big things about Farage is he always thought he was loved by this audience, and he's not. He's kind of past his days now. He's kind of part of the kind of past. And they don't want that kind of aggressiveness, especially in today's kind of society. You see a lot of humour around lockdowns. This was some of their kind of Facebook kind of posts, stuff about kind of weight and the 4 stages of quarantine. Some more kind of humorous stuff, some stuff about kind of the sunlight, social distancing, bar fights, and kind of outside kind of Primark, the kind of queues. And I love this one. Went for a nice jog this morning. No one cares. British humour, it's kind of finest. So seeing a lot of humour, and I think this is kind of this audience's way of kind of laughing their way out of a very kind of difficult situation. You see a gender banter. Not as much as maybe I've seen in the past from the men, but it's still there through the kind of Facebook kind of posts. So things that men do that upset women: lie, be honest, not talk too much, not show emotions, be too emotional, breathe. So this is some of the kind of posts that you see here of that kind of gender kind of banter. On the flip side, the women, you're seeing a lot of the kind of kick-ass women. So it's kind of girl power with kind of attitude kind of coming through. So I'm a grown woman. I'm not an effing princess. I have attitude, opinions, very loud voice, and one hell of a right hook. Believe me when I say I got this shit. So you see a lot of this kind of coming through, which real kind of cry. We're strong women. We're going to kind of get through this. Beyond the material, seeing a lot of stuff about families, pictures about daughters, pictures about fish and nature and things we like, connections with kind of family and kind of children coming through. Mental health, and I think this is a really good fact that this is coming through. You know, so seeing a lot of kind of Facebook posts on the kind of mental health, only from women, which is the worrying bit, but only from women. But a lot of kind of things about true isolation and true self-development, what is anxiety and depression, why we kind of need to kind of stay positive. If you need to believe in something, start with yourself. Never too late to get your shit together. And I find this audience often have these kind of mottos. If you ever go into a mass mainstream house, especially recruiters, that is a great example. Often they have like perfect mum and these kind of little sayings of about kind of self-confidence and how you should kind of relate to that, like positive kind of messages. memories of the past. And we'll send this round so you can see this later, but this was on someone's Facebook post which got a lot of likes, with how good the past was. Grew up in Oldham, eating fish and chips only occasionally, only had one phone in the house, played kind of cops and robbers, had no microwave, drunk from the tap, etc. So real going that memories of past when people feel very, very kind of safe. I like this because it feels more kind of middle class, but I'm seeing more and more of this as kind of cute and kind of twee. So kind of the tweeness coming back, which kind of fits with maybe with that kind of sense of kind of more country living and connection with kind of nature and dreaming of the perfect escape. So a lot of people would be talking, especially the females that I spoke to, were talking about they were looking for holidays, often secretly from their husband, but they're dreaming of that kind of perfect escape. And there's a lot of imagery of holidays that we went to in the past, or where we'd like to kind of go and what we're kind of dreaming of. And they're angry about kind of litter. So I think this is really positive in terms of the kind of environment. So there was a lot of outrage and a lot of anger about people just destroying nature and kind of leaving kind of litter, and people like, things have got so nice, why are you kind of doing this? So just some kind of shared wishes that I kind of exposed through. So unity. So there's a sense they want people to come together. In many ways the UK has become very kind of the not divided nation. Brexit, Remain, vegetarian versus kind of meat eater, city versus kind of rural, Labour versus conservative, and they don't want that. It doesn't feel very British. England's a trading nation. They want unity. They want people to come together. They want decency, people to be kind to people and to the environment. And they like those shows of decency. Rashford was a good example of that. The Major, who raised money, was a really, really good example of that. Protection. So they want to kind of look after their physical and mental health and economic kind of well-being, both from themselves and their kind of family. Fun. There's a sense that you shouldn't take life kind of too seriously. Honesty. They want to see more straight talking and a sense of kind of honesty. And fairness, making the unfair fair is another really kind of important element, because they feel they've suffered for a long time. We've got some film, but as we said, we won't show it, we'll send it through. So, but what the film did show was some kind of key kind of fears, and there's really a number of fears, probably 4 key fears. The first one is there's a fear of there's going to be a kind of second lockdown. So people are really, really scared and really kind of worried about that. The next fear is fear about the kind of economy. So fear that the economy is going to kind of crash, because these will be the people that will suffer the most. The third thing is there's a fear that this elevation of the key workers and the working class hero will kind of collapse and just kind of be forgotten. And the last one, which is really important, is there's fear and actually anger, because they're noticing that brands are putting their prices up. And people are really kind of noticing this, and people are really, really angry, which means that if you've done any kind of social action, any messages about helping people, if you now put your prices up, you will be punishing them, and they will not forgive you for this. People are talking about going to Burger King and it being airport prices. People are really, really kind of angry, but they want brands to help them. So they want brands. So they talk about insurance brands that kind of help them. They say that brands that help me will be remembered. It's this purpose, and I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm going to be honest, I hate the word purpose, because I don't know what purpose essentially means. And I think purpose in the COVID world is a redundant argument. So should we do purpose, or should we focus on price? Should we focus on customer service, or is purpose more important? I think it's redundant, because I think what brands should be looking at is how can you make these people's lives better? And I think if you start from that premise, what we're going to do is make these people's lives better. And that can be a lot of things. That could be support in a youth club. It could be work around kind of mental health, but it could be maintaining kind of low prices. It could be price coupons. It could be having a Merlin pass. It could be a multitude of different things. But I think it's about how can we make people's lives better? Some brands haven't performed well. Some have been inactive. And I think part of the worry here was when COVID first started, brands were kind of nervous to kind of get started. But by being slow and being inactive, it's done more kind of damage. So what people wanted to see at this stage was they just wanted to see brands doing something, and they didn't care what you kind of do at the beginning stage. So there was a lot of brands that come in too late. Some brands are just doing the wrong kind of messages. So, and I think this is, I like empathy and I understand the importance of empathy, but I think empathy can get mistranslated. And I think when it's kind of mistranslated, what you end up with is, hey, we're a brand. We understand what you're like. We're in it together. We're your mate. We're your best friend. We're going to hold your hand. We're really going to look after you. Basically, this audience to think that's bollocks, pardon my French. So brands can help in the following kind of ways. So what they want to see is fairness, not togetherness. So why they wanted brands to help them during COVID was not to be their kind of best friend and to be with them. Why they wanted brands to help them was because they paid a lot of money in brands in the past and they thought it was fair that brands helped them. They want leadership. They don't want consultation. They want a brand to take the lead and make direction and decide what it's going to do. They don't want to be your best friends. They want service. And really due to the kind of ads and where the ads are going, they don't want conformity. They want brands to have a sense of kind of difference. Ultimately, I think we have to have a situation where you put the customer above profit, and watching your prices is key here. And I always bang the drum on this, reframe things, start thinking about the citizen, not the consumer. Most people think the ads out there are boring. So they're all the same. They're trying too hard. I love this one. They remind me of those beta males who are just trying to be nice, pretending to be your friend, but really they just want to shag you. And I think that's how brands, kind of some brands operate in their kind of advertising. They're just trying too hard. There's a sense of they're too focused on kind of reality. And it's like, we know about Corona. We don't want to keep being reminded about Corona. There's a feeling they're just kind of too empathetic, or the wrong form of kind of empathy. You don't understand me. You don't live my life. Don't try and be my friend. But also just keeping pace with change. So at first, sure, people wanted to know how to kind of navigate the world of kind of Corona. And supermarkets did a really good job of that and great ads. But after that, not everyone wanted to be reminded about we're in it together and that sense of kind of togetherness. In Corona, what people wanted to be is entertained because people were bored. And I think there are three styles of advertising that I think have worked well. We have lots of videos on these kind of ads and we'll send them to the agencies. I think the first one is what I call grounded purpose. So purpose can go wrong, and I discussed that kind of earlier. But I think if you're going to do it properly, it has to be grounded in people's lives. And mental health is one of the key things where it can really reflect and make a difference to people's lives. Cocky and fun. So that sense of just being out there and kind of having fun and being kind of super confident. But I think the other good thing about KFC is it's just true to the brand. So it's just true to the brand values. And people want to see that authenticity. They don't want you merging into something you're not. And the last one, and I argue this ad, the Just Eats probably did more for people's moods than any other ad out there. Just that escape from realism, that escape from boredom. And I think this was a fantastic ad that did that. So the views on the government, how do people feel about the kind of government? So this is a model that I kind of use. So on one axis, it comes from stereotype, from literature, but on one side you kind of got warm and competent, warm and incompetent, cold and incompetent, and cold and competent. And warmth essentially is the factor of kind of trust, that you trust someone and you have a strong relationship, and competent is being good at what you kind of do. And it falls into different places. So if you're warm and competent, you have pride and admiration. If you're warm and incompetent, it's pity and kind of sympathy. If you're cold and incompetent, you get contempt. And cold and competent is often kind of the world of kind of fear and kind of envy. So the government, not overall, because there are some people who still support it, but what I've seen is a big kind of decline in that. And I think part of the reason they support that is probably because at the moment they wouldn't necessarily go to Labour. But at the start of the crisis, there was a lot of warmth towards the government. It was a government of unity. It was a war against an individual enemy. Boris felt very strong and positive. However, there was a lot of people started talking about they felt the lockdown was kind of too late. Then what you got a shift, and you got the shift to a bit more pity and sympathy. This government's never really handled a crisis like this before. Boris was in hospital, but then things started to kind of go wrong. So rising number of deaths, cabinet kind of looked out for its kind of depths. You got the kind of care homes, terrible briefing, and I think that's where things start to go a little bit wrong. That kind of stay alert, which people were very, very kind of confused about. But I think at this stage, most people, and some people are still here, had sympathy, but with kind of the government and with some kind of excuses. I think where it's kind of shifted more to now is a rising number of deaths, a redialing of the thought that lockdown should have been kind of earlier. There's a feeling that not shutting down the kind of protests, which we'll come to later, Dominic Cummings and track and trace. So I think people are starting to have more and more kind of contempt for the kind of government. And what I'm seeing is the perception of Boris has kind of changed. So I did the work about why the kind of red wall kind of crumbled, and Boris was seen as a really kind of strong leader. I think for a few, he still embodies that, but for many, he's not seen as that strong, feeling he can't get to the point, he's vague, he's not firm, he's a bit too kind of nice. A few people can say he's controlled by Dominic Cummings, I think. Who's Emu? They say it was like Rod. Is it Rod from Emu? They said Dominic Cummings was like Rod from, and Boris Johnson was like Emu, someone said. However, some still have sympathy from him. They know he's recovering from illness. They feel that everyone has a knife out for him. And some feel that he's the only one who kind of really understands people like us. And there's that sense that no one has done this before. It's uncharted territory. But what you are starting to see, which I've noticed, I've been tracking these Facebook group for over 6 months, is starting to see some negative kind of memes coming through, like vague and kind of this kind of question here, this one here, who be a millionaire kind of spoof. So Dominic Cummings affair. So this was an interesting one. So some people supported Dominic Cummings, and I saw this quite a lot in kind of Facebook, and a lot of Facebook posts were kind of being placed in his kind of defence. A lot of it was coming from kind of Brexit kind of quarters and Brexit groups, and then kind of being kind of reshared. And this minority felt that media stitched him up, that he was looking after his family, and that he was being hounded by the press. What was interesting, I think, at this time is there didn't seem to be that many people on Facebook as kind of usually, and it felt that the message didn't push onwards. So this message didn't push out on Facebook. Also with the pubs and the clubs and people not being able to communicate with their friends and families, those that held this opinion didn't really get this opinion out. So this was very much more a minority opinion. Some had sympathy, but thought he was wrong. So they could understand the family aspect. So I'm doing it to kind of protect my kind of family. But then the press conference happened and they thought that was a shambles. They didn't buy into his lack of eyesight, just visiting a kind of castle kind of rhetoric. But the majority just thought he was wrong. And it's not because he's part of the elite. Someone said to me, oh, it's because it's elite and the elite can do this. That's not the issue. The issue from this audience was one about fairness and hypocrisy. It was felt as what he did was unfair and what he did was hypocritical. And there was concern that his actions would encourage irresponsible kind of behaviour. What's interesting, and we'll send you the films, is that when we asked people a week later after the Dominic Cummings affair how they kind of felt, those who were angry had kind of calmed down, and other issues had been kind of put into kind of people's minds. So it felt it was just a kind of storm in a kind of teacup. It was unfair, but not as unfair as a kind of protest. Dominic did it to protect his kind of family. At the time I was really angry, but now I don't care. What about the opposition? So Keir in the opposition, so about half the sample didn't know who he was, and they didn't. They just went blank when I mentioned his name. But for those that do, there is a feeling that he's starting to perform well. So he doesn't feel anti-British. I think the Cernist kind of does that. He feels intelligent. He feels like a prime minister. He's good at kind of questioning. He's pushing the government. And he's talking and supporting the NHS, which is something this audience really, really kind of care about. I think what people don't know so much about is what is the Labour Party and what does the Labour Party now stand for. Trust in the media. So this kind of surprised me, and again we have some really nice films that kind of support this, but we'll send them round. So there's a lot of kind of distrust in the kind of media. I'm seeing kind of this kind of memes about kind of truth. This kind of meme here, it's the media, and a lot of kind of anger. So people will talk about photos and how photos have been kind of in different kind of directions. This was kind of how it was unpacked, and there's a feeling that the media are constantly kind of lying. BBC will be kind of classed as kind of liberal kind of snowflakes, and there's a number of reasons why the media is kind of distrusted. And I think the first one is despair, and it's especially for newspapers as well. So feeling the media kind of is playing on kind of fear, and these people have heard corona, 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 corona. They don't want to just keep being reminded about how bad things are. They know things are bad and they're feeling that presence, but it just builds on kind of anxieties. There's a feeling the media kind of lies and kind of spins its own kind of narrative. So it will say things one day and then the next day it will change its opinion. I think someone said that about Dominic Cummings in the Mail, that they were out for him, out for him, out for him. And then a few days later, they were defending him, constantly kind of shifting kind of position, feeling that the journalists are often kind of quite bullying, feeling that the journalists that media doesn't represent them, and it feels very much for snowflakes and liberals, and just a feeling that it's incomplete, not telling the full kind of story. So a good example of that would be the media with the Black Lives Matter protest, and then the far right protest afterwards, and how the headlines were different in every kind of newspaper, and how people were seeing different kind of feeds and different elements of violence, and that violence some people believe not being kind of reported. And people are dipping out the kind of newspapers, and they're not buying newspapers as much, and they say they're dipping out the news. This is claimed, and the figures might be different or might not, but I think it's important to say that the media is becoming more and more distrust. And I think this is important. And it's interesting, the BBC were having a go at social media and they're saying social media is responsible for a lot of the bad things that are kind of conspiracy theories that are having from COVID. But I think also mainstream media has to take some of the blame as well, because people don't trust it as much as they once did. So I think having the official narratives means kind of gets more kind of distorted. So I'm surprised it comes to this is from conspiracy theorists. I spoke to 3 conspiracy theorists, and it's probably the craziest couple of hours I've ever had in my life. So I'm surprised it come back so soon. I'll be honest, it shocked me. It shocked me how full on. I never thought they'd do anything bigger than 9/11, but this, wow, this is a different league, and it shocked me. I wasn't expecting it. He thinks it's a massive conspiracy theory. It's not unusual. Every pandemic is followed by conspiracy theories. So in the past, pandemics were often were blamed on the kind of Jews and buttons, actually. So when buttons first came out, they were blamed for the plague, which is an interesting one. 19th century blamed on elites. Spanish flu was blamed on Germany, and Russian flu blamed on earthquakes. And then since the 1930s, what we've seen is conspiracy theories being based much more around kind of social engineering. So everything from kind of AIDS to kind of SARS felt that it's kind of human tinkering, kind of come from a lab kind of mentality kind of coming through. And a few people are heavily into conspiracy theories, and they're proud. They're proud to be called the truthers, and they're constantly looking up theories. They're connecting many dots that don't kind of necessarily exist. They don't really trust anyone. They're even questioning me. Do you work for the government? Are you a true truther? They were asking me. I was like, no, I'm not a truther. They're confident in expressing their opinions, very kind of verbally or kind of online. There's community groups, a little bit like Karma conspiracy theories, where they all get together and discuss things. They generally feel like outsiders that don't fit in. They often have a wide circle of international friends, and they can come from any side of the political debate, right, left, even liberals. So it's not to do with kind of politics necessarily. And what they're saying is, since COVID, everyone's where they've been ignored in the past and seen as a bit of a nutcase, now people are kind of hunting out their kind of opinions. And there's a range of different kind of sources. So the obvious ones like David Icke, they're kind of using. Black the Ripper is a grime star who went missing, and people think he's murdered. And he apparently burnt down a 5G mast, and people feel he knew the truth about kind of 5G. Lots of different kind of sources, RT, press, even mainstream sources like the Byline Times, which someone said they called Conspiracy Times, TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook, but less so, because these people tend to avoid kind of Facebook. Just some conspiracy theories. Trump is a murderer and a paedophile. All politicians are acting. We're living in the world of the Truman Show. Celebrities are owned, so they're kind of created. Greta Thunberg is staged. Extinction Rebellion are actors. and the world is controlled by a handful of kind of individuals, like the 12 that are kind of controlling the kind of world, and they own China, they own Russia, they own everything. Soros is trying to control things, and Bill Gates just wants to wipe us out. So some of the conspiracy theories are kind of coming through. They believe that COVID was foretold. So someone was telling me about in the 2012 Olympics, Boris Johnson was in a bed and he was sick, and there was a dummy. So that must be to do with kind of COVID, and was a foresight for that. Obama apparently predicted it. George Bush predicted it. David Bowie, he's apparently just before he kind of died, he said about 5G. And obviously, if you look at a £10 note, it has 5G towers and COVID on it. Some other ones, COVID. So people are forced to put COVID on their death certificate. The kind of government wants to kind of kill us. Only one person believed that. But what's interesting is conspiracy. That's a hardcore conspiracy, the truth is. But what's interesting is conspiracy theories are starting to percolate into the mass mainstream, to the as the mum and as the kind of dad. And this was before COVID. But what you see here, basically two thirds of British people believe in a conspiracy theory, and the main one is kind of the elite control. The government's kind of hiding kind of immigration, hiding kind of immigrants in this country. So there's a belief that kind of Brits believe in kind of conspiracy theories. And the mass mainstream is becoming more engaged. And I think COVID's kind of done that. So the bigger the issue, the bigger the kind of conspiracy. And the idea that this could be just bats is just too kind of small. This is an audience that feel kind of powerless. They kind of lack control. They've gone inwards, and their external just feels very hostile and wild and far away. There's a high degree of kind of uncertainty. There's a trust void. They don't trust government, don't trust media. There's this merging of worlds of kind of fantasy and kind of reality. Many different sides of politics seem to reflect conspiracy theories, and sometimes people in their echo chamber, but people start feeding little conspiracy theories in kind of dripping them. But conspiracy theories are sometimes true. I mean, I think that's the other thing to say. There's a lot of ones around kind of smoking, which was kind of a good example of that in the past that have been proven to be true. And for some, it can fill their kind of gaps of understanding of the world. It can provide a sense of self and security and control. So if we kind of go back, sorry, that should be conspiracy theories, the wrong kind of title there, to this kind of map. And if we kind of look on this as in stereotypes, what you often get is pity and sympathy, things that you feel kind of warm against but incompetent. Often the elderly and sadly often disabled people. And I'll be honest, and this is my only political rant, but I think the advertising world can sometimes see disabled people as pity and sympathy, because I think how many board members are kind of disabled, and I can't think of any. And I think I know one person who's disabled apart from myself who works in this kind of industry. But what's interesting is fear and envy, cold and competent, because nearly all conspiracy theories will land in this axis here. So Trump, for some, is seen as cold, but you don't have a relationship, and for some, competent. Dominic Cummings is this master intelligent person, must be owned by the Russians because he's cold and competent. Soros, the awful things about the Jews, the Asians in Uganda, Freemasons, nearly every conspiracy theory will fall into this axis of cold and kind of competent. And what you've got at the moment is you've got people's relationships with things that are really kind of cold. So COVID, massive kind of disease, really cold, but really good at what it kind of does. China, massive country, really powerful, don't trust it. 5G, big kind of power, big business, USA, social engineering, Bill Gates. And what happens is some people make just different threads across these. Most believe COVID came from a Chinese lab. China's seen negatively, as just mentioned, egomaniacs, barbaric, cruel, don't value human life, powerful. But it also acts to that kind of aspect, kind of social kind of engineering. Only a few believe 5G is related to COVID. So it's not widely kind of believed, and most people don't kind of see a link. But what it has done is opened up trust in 5G. So the mass mainstream are starting to mistrust 5G because they feel that it's kind of killing nature, killing birds, killing trees, causing cancer, mass kind of surveillance. So even though they might not believe in the conspiracy theories, it started making them question 5G and what its kind of impacts are. The majority of this audience are against conspiracy theories being banned. They feel it's liberal totalitarianism, which I talked about earlier. It's someone telling them kind of how they kind of think, but they think it's social media companies are hiding things. And also there's evidence as well through Levin that actually tagging and banning can actually increase interest. It doesn't always close it down. So it also can make conspiracy theories just seem more kind of believable. So why is Facebook doing this? It must be kind of true. But I think the issues are much deeper than the ban. So it's about giving people a kind of sense of worth. It's about helping people navigate uncertainty and about providing hope. And I think if you do those kind of issues and focus on them, you can stem off some of this conspiracy. And we'll talk about that kind of later. Science is mixed, is kind of respected. What you find is often that people look for scientists that kind of supports their kind of issues. I think there's a belief that people this audience often thought that science was absolute, and I think they now understand that science isn't absolute, and that's quite disappointing for this kind of audience, because they've seen how many deaths were predicted and how many kind of happened, for instance. This is a really difficult area to kind of talk around. Their views on Black Lives Matter, because it's quite different, and I debated it, and I debated whether to talk about it, and I felt if I didn't talk about it, people would either tone it down or not necessarily say what this audience is kind of saying. And I thought, if you don't hear what this audience is going to say, then nothing will kind of change. There's two aspects. There was some that had really far right views, and I've got a lot of stuff on far right narratives, but that wasn't the mainstream. So if anyone's doing work around extremism and just wants to talk to me for 20 minutes around those kind of narratives, I'm more than happy to kind of do that. So a few openly support BLM, tend to be younger, often students from the cities. They're finding that when they state their beliefs online, they're often kind of drowned out. And it's interesting, actually, when I first mentioned that some attitudes about from this audience on BLM on LinkedIn, that everyone was kind of quiet. But then I started getting quite a lot of emails from people saying, yeah, I've got family, or I know working class, so I've been in this kind of chat room and I've kind of discovered this. They're trying to have debates with their family members, and someone said, I just tried to say that my brother's got white privilege, and my dad just couldn't get it and understand what that kind of meant and why that's kind of true. But some of the positive messages are kind of coming through. So people looting, so here. A few do hold far right views. They tend to be very angry at society. They're tolerated by the mass mainstream. Most people know them, but most people think they're idiots. They are often keyboard warriors. They've been following far right for a long time, connected to kind of football clubs. In the past, they talked about culture, but now they're talking about race. And ultimately, they would start talking about Islam, but now they're talking about race. And the mask has slipped off. They're racist. Finding females, especially with Tommy Robinson, there's a lot of females kind of connecting or warm to him. And it does include some young people. And I talk about that in Traditionalists Strike Back, how a third of young people are moving back to more kind of traditional kind of memes, traditional viewpoints. But the majority dislike the far right. Look, they want to hurt people. They're too revolutionary. This is an audience that doesn't like fast change. This is an audience that doesn't want to see London burn. They don't want a race war. They're seen as embarrassing. They represent the past. They're judging people by skin colour. They're giving Britain a bad name. They're seen as stupid. They're just seen as cowards. And they dislike the far right protests. They thought they were violent, terrible on the kind of pace, embarrassing, the Nazi salutes, the guy pissing up the monument. They felt they were unfair, and they just thought that, as I said, revolutionary. No one wants a country kind of to burn. They understand, this audience understands why America's protesting. They thought the death was absolutely awful, one of the worst things they've kind of seen. Policeman was beyond cruel. They understand how unfair it is that black people are being treated in America. They know there's kind of big kind of social kind of problems. They know America's racist, and they know that Trump is kind of racist, and they applauded and appreciate good citizens here. So you saw it in Facebook posts, and people were like, what a decent bloke, fantastic, great, helping the ex-policeman. But they don't like the Black Lives Matter process in the UK. A number of reasons for that. They see it as an American issue, so they can't understand systematic racism and how it applies to the UK. They don't see the UK as being racist in that case, although we know it is. They're fearful that protests will create a kind of second lockdown, which is one of their kind of biggest kind of fears. They think it's insulting to people who've stayed in and obeyed the kind of lockdown. They felt it put strain on NHS, which is one of the things they really care about. It feels too revolutionary. So when statues fall, that feels like revolution, which feels that it's too fast and they feel they'll suffer. They don't understand the concept of kind of white privilege. It's a complicated area that they can't get their head around, and we'll come to that in a minute. Just like the breakdown of law and order, they fear riots. There probably is a loss of power. So when I did work in the Protestant community, I saw this, and I read a lot about the kind of Balkans, and you see this in Serbia, that kind of loss of power. And when groups become more kind of entrenched, they become more and more kind of insular. But it's also an attack on the aspects of the past that make them feel kind of safe. So they don't see racism in the UK as being that kind of widespread. They often say, well, we have Asians in cabinet, for instance. They don't understand white privilege. They can't get their head around it because they don't feel privileged. And they see those allies of Black Lives Matter as being kind of privileged because they see that as kind of woke, but they don't see that as themselves. And for them, this feels kind of selective. It kind of suggests kind of division, and it kind of makes them feel like they're an outsider. So they can't get their heads around the concept of white privilege. They thought the protests were unfair. They've stayed in for a long time. They've been wound up about Dominic Cummings, and then there was lots of people on the kind of streets, couldn't cope with a kind of second wave spreading. It's just wrong, should have been kind of shut down. So that's quite hard things. It's idiots that are kind of doing this. So they were very negative about the protests, which they thought were unfair. And fairness is one of the most important things for this kind of audience. They dislike division. So this was on their Facebook. You can read it in your own leisure. But I'm sick of Black versus White, Tory versus Labour, etc., etc. They don't like this concept that we're a divided kind of country. They're angry about the kind of violence. They're angry about the kind of riots, the kind of poor police being kind of beaten. And that applies both for the far right and also for BLM. And they're upset about the tax of statues. Do you remember at the beginning I talked about Britishness, and that's one thing you can't take away from this audience, or they believe you can't take away from this audience, where there's a feeling that it had been kind of taken away. And that means their memories and their past and their sense of security have essentially kind of gone. So especially the attacks on kind of Winston Churchill. The other attacks, the ones on the slave trader, people like it was done in the wrong kind of manner, but maybe if they had a plaque on there, or maybe if they had a local kind of vote and it had kind of been put into a museum, they would have kind of accepted it. Although they're cynical of the government, so you'd have to tell them what museum it's kind of going into. The tax on statues created a lot of kind of whataboutism. People talk about kind of slavery and the kind of Romans. And that's kind of hitting brands, especially brands like kind of Nike. So people are saying, okay, you're saying this, but can you support the World Cup, which is being built by slaves at the moment in Qatar? They think the media is kind of biased. So they think it didn't report the full story, and it has a biased kind of edge towards it. And they feel political correctness has gone into overdrive. And I think this is important, that you get hyperlocal on one side, which is people who are very anti-political kind of correctness, very kind of small world. Then on the other side, you've got global citizens, which are more kind of pro-political correctness. This audience kind of accept diversity, they like diversity, but they just feel that it's gone in overdrive. Some of that's fed by the kind of newspapers, some of that's fed by social media kind of posts, but they feel political correctness has kind of gone too kind of far. One of the big things I think is they just want to move on. They just want to get down the pub. They don't want to divide a country. They just want to have drinks, talk about football, and talk about haircuts and get on with their kind of life. So the kind of few kind of thoughts. So we're entering the biggest battleground for ideas since the 1980s, I'd argue since maybe the 1930s. None of these are new, but it's a blank canvas, and all these sides now will be dialing up to target this mass mainstream audience, from environmentalists, deniers, centrism. I'm not going to use the word populism because I think populism can be a force of good, but that's a different subject. Globalism versus nationalism, diversity versus privilege, capitalism versus state control. And there's a big question, where will the mass mainstream go? So it's a massive kind of issue, and I don't know the answer. But their feelings are quite dark. They're frustrated, they're angry, confused, uncertain, and restfulness. And there's a time of high fear, divided nation, second wave, collapsing economy, rising prices, fast kind of social kind of change. And in the past, the present was tough. You know, it was hard for this audience, hard for a mass mainstream audience. Rising cost of poverty, couldn't afford to save, rising prices, etc., etc. But the future is going to be total shit. And this is an audience that's really going to kind of suffer, and it's really going to kind of impact on this audience. There's a big trust void, losing trust in the government, rise of kind of conspiracy theories, don't trust international bodies like WHO, which is seen as just a big government quango, don't trust the media, and alternative narratives are kind of feeding through. And that's through social media channels, alternative media channels like Russia Today, but also mainstream journalism. So what's interesting is when people studied the far right and narratives, actually some mainstream journalists who use facts and then open those facts up with lots of question marks, or it could be about conspiracy theories, it may have come from a lab. That is more dangerous in some ways than actually the alt-right groups. And so there's big opportunities for brands to give clarity and direction, leadership, play into hope, pride, care and joy, emotions, and just help people make their lives kind of better. But there's a fundamental thing, we're near the end, fundamental thing the industry needs to do. You need to address your own prejudices. And brands need to move beyond the prototypicality. If someone said to me a prototypicality of a bird, I'll go with something that flies. Prototypicality of the mass mainstream is they live in poverty. They're chavs. They're obese, don't look after themselves. They're the idiots that voted for Brexit. They're the pissheads. They're the far rights. And what we need to move is you need to move to some pride and admiration. And we have to have a sense of respect for this audience to bring them on board. Because while we have these other things, we'll always be in a negative place and never really understand them. And I think one of the big things is to appreciate and amplify their key values, because they're things we can all share. Respect, family, decency, community, and fairness. And that ends my presentation.
Steve.
Hopefully people are still there.
Yes. Not only are they there, they are engaging, commenting, and loving it by the sounds of it. Steve, that was really great. Yeah, people have very much enjoyed it. So to kick things off, I've got a feeling that you're going to have quite a lot of questions coming out of this.
Good.
People would like to start noting things down and putting them into the question sort of section on the right there. That'd be fantastic. Just to confirm, everyone will be getting a copy of the deck that Steve will be sending through, and I'll post in a second the link to the showcase where the videos are as well. So you will be able to see all of it in its glory, and also access this webinar afterwards too, if need be, just as a recording. So lots of opportunities to revisit. And we've got till 2:30. So let's see what we can get through in terms of questions. The first one that came in, I'm going to go in order actually of what we early, actually, almost an hour ago. So you've been stimulating the conversation right from the start. Is the pride and Britishness an English-only notion for this audience? Would that pride exist in Scotland or Wales? How much of this is about Englishness?
I think it is more. I think you got different pride. I think you have your Welsh pride and your Scottish pride, but I think it's very English. I think it's a very English mindset. But it's a really good question.
Great.
Where I see the biggest division actually is, as I said, when you talk to more global kind of citizens, and I was just like, what does Britishness mean to you? And you show the word, and people are like, it just doesn't really mean anything. And actually, when you show it to this audience, people are like, yeah, it means everything.
Okay, good point. And here's another question. This one's from Matthew Turner. How does the issue of conspiracy theories match to the earlier idea that they like simple messages? It sounds like they demand more complex answers to the pandemic, i.e., can't it just be a bat or an illness?
It's a really good point actually. I think when you feel really kind of powerless, and I think for me it's that whole fact that the bigger the issue, the bigger the conspiracy theory. And that's, if you look at the history of conspiracy theories, that's the main thing. And this is the biggest thing anyone's ever faced. And I think the thought that it could just come from bats or even from nature, because don't we control nature? You know, it's like, yeah. It's just too little for people to get their heads around.
It is.
And I was surprised. I mean, 2 out of 75 people believe the official narrative. That's quite big.
Say that again.
2 out of 75 people believe the official narrative that I spoke to. Okay, it's not one, but that's quite big.
It is indeed. Okay, we've got another question here around what are the new trust icons? Not brands, not mainstream media.
That is such a hard question, because Jamie Inham didn't come from him, did it? From Web Channel. He asked me to answer that question, and I think it's really difficult. I think there's a massive trust void that I've never seen. I think trust has declined, but there's a very little bit in the government, but people don't really trust Boris Johnson. People don't trust the science. People don't trust the media, brands potentially, and friends and family, but it's worryingly scarce.
I'll ask you this question at the end, Steve, but I'm going to ask you how optimistic you feel about things later. Where do you think, and this is another one from Lisa, where did they think unity might come from, i.e. grassroots or community? Where could unity come from?
Yeah, I think grassroots is together. I think what was sad is we kind of had it at the beginning of kind of COVID. I think we had I felt we had a real shift from the I to the we, and from the individualism to collectivism. I still think to a degree that will kind of continue, but I think we really had that kind of sense of kind of unity that I've never seen, and I think a number of issues have kind of broken that and kind of pulled that, sadly, kind of away. But I think it's a lot of grassroots. I think a lot of it's got to be through understanding. We just got to start understanding people and understanding who people are, what they think, and why they think things, and how can we make people's lives kind of better. And I think universal values is always a good place to play. So I think talk about universal values, the things that unite us, whoever we are, is an important space.
Good stuff. Just a note, we've posted the link to the videos now on the chat here, but we'll send it around later. But if you click on that from the chat, you'll be able to revisit the video straight away if you want as well. Okay, here's another question. This one's from Rana Brightman. As much as this audience felt some brands got it wrong, re Black Lives Matter with Nike, or not a fan of Branson and Virgin, are they actively boycotting brands that don't speak to them, or just piss them off?
It's a really interesting question. So I think it's something you probably need the numbers for to kind of show. But I know, was it Typhoon Tea, when they did that Twitter statement, they had a racist who said, "I'm glad you're not supporting Black Lives Matter." Yorkshire. Yeah. If I remember rightly from the stats, they looked at YouGov looked at Brexit supporters. I think it was 20% said they would boycott the brand. But obviously, what people say they do and what people do is a little bit different. But I think there could be implications. The other thing a lot of people are talking about is boycotting the local shops that put the prices up. So that's another area.
Yeah, interesting.
But it's always hard to know, because I think when people have got lots of things on their mind and then on autopilot,
yeah, absolutely,
you're really going to hunt around for the right brand.
It's true.
Ethics can go out the window.
Okay, here's one coming from Gabriel Noble. Is there work to be done in the codes and frames we use when talking about working class in order to make a more inclusive term which represents the reality of multi-ethnic nature of the working class in the UK?
It's a really good question. So what the evidence I've seen is that more and more people are using the term themselves working class, which is why I use it. Sometimes I'd flip into the word mass mainstream. I think for me what's important is showing a tapestry of working class where it can connect across multitudes of different kind of people. So I think some of the key worker stuff did that really, really well. I think the sense of the key worker support was started to really kind of create that element of the kind of working class hero. So I think that's the kind of spaces that I go into.
That's really interesting. Okay, here's another one from Matthew Bamford Bowes. Does their desire of looking to the past, sorry, let's jump that, or desire for it actually stop them from looking towards the things or ideas that might help them progress? So they past. Yeah. The big problem you've got is that the far right and extremists and the far left to extent, what they'll always do is they'll say there's a bright future out there, hope. Hey, the present's been really shit, there's a bright future, lots of hope, but it's just going to be what you remember from the past, which is familiar. And then actually, if you're more centrist government trying to project that idea of a hope,
that's not rooted in some part of the past is really, really difficult, because people at the moment need the past because it makes them feel safe.
Yeah, exactly, because they've lived through it, right?
Yeah, and they need it. It's safety. It's an anchor.
It is. Did you see, and this one's from Hannah Chalmers, did you see any different attitudes in relation to gender?
Did I see? No, I think this is a really interesting question. The only thing I do see a little bit of kind of differences is around the concept of banter, actually. So I think blokes really kind of into kind of banter. I went on a working class banter group on Facebook, and it really wasn't that bantery. So I think that's one element. I think people are quite unified, actually. I don't see much differences. I think that sense of aggressive girl power was one. I think the embracing of mental health more from females was another one, not from the males. Maybe a more sense of kind of mothering and kind of that sense of kind of protectionist from this. I think this audience, in terms of females, feminism doesn't work for this audience because it's all about women in power suits, and explain that to a woman who's working in a chicken factory has no kind of relevance. So I think there's elements that you can pull out and pull those.
Okay. Interesting question. Hello, Adam. So Adam Chmielowski is asked, why do you think political right and conspiracy theorists like anti-vaxxers often do better to engage many in this sector of society?
Because they play on fear. It's simple. And someone asked me the other day about the government, and they said, do you think the government is playing a culture war? And I think it's a really, really difficult one to do. And a really, really difficult one to kind of analyse, because they're doing 8 groups a week and they're doing quant with this audience. So they're doing probably more on me. So maybe they're just picking up messages and then reflecting it because they want to feel warm and competent with this audience again. But I think that's that sense of kind of culture war. I think what the right do is the right will take the insights and then put it down into a place of fear. And that's why I said about populism. I don't think populism necessarily can be bad. And I'm going to go on a ramble here, but I think it's really interesting. I read something about Klopp the other day and how Klopp won, and they talked about Klopp as a populist. And they said he's a populist because he's not anti-intellectual, but he believes in egalitarian. He believes in hope. He believes everyone should have a chance. He believes in fairness, and he believes not in power for power's sake, but he believes everyone should be powerful. That's good populism. That will counter the far right.
Got it. Good stuff. Here's another question from Rana Brightman. Interesting one. What can the middle class do to improve its image in the eyes of the working class?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think let's just try and let's break down the echo chambers. For me, I just think that we're just in such an echo chambery world, and I think until we break those echo chambers and start listening and start, I think we need to confront our own stereotypes and our own biases. It's interesting, isn't it? In diversity, class is one thing we never ever want to talk about. Maybe disability as well, but class definitely, because it makes us feel uncomfortable. And I think and one of the things I was talking about the other day is I hate class deniers. You know, we are a class society. Let's be clear, we're based on class, and it's a problem.
Good stuff. And related to echo chambers, question from John Griffiths: is localism a way out, or just another way for echo chambers to flourish?
Yeah, I think localism is. I think there's definitely a need to recreate the communities and recreate the community spirit. I think that was decimated, especially when you start falling more in that's probably more towards the C2D, maybe of the E kind of elements. You just see these areas and they're just run down, you know. And that sense of community has changed. I remember growing up in Feltham, and you saw it there. It's a real working class town, a really working class kind of area. And then a lot of middle class people moved in, and people were really busy, and not everyone worked in the same kind of place. The big fences went up, and no one knew each other, and there was no conversation. And then the pubs shut down. So all the community aspects. So I think localism, but I think localism needs to be in how can we recreate a sense of community.
So this question is from Hannah. Hello, Hannah. How could some of Hannah Marcus, how could some of these findings impact on recruitment pipelines into our industry as well as for brands?
I think it's a really important area to kind of to look at. I think the experts on this is very much Reach and very much the House 51, and they've done a lot of work on this and what the kind of differences are. And I really enjoyed their webinar the other day, and I thought it was excellent. And I just remember someone talking about how in the past a lot of the creatives had come from the post room, and I felt that, you know, in the 80s and 90s, you felt those ads they just knew the mass mainstream. They just knew the trigger points. And I think that's been lost a little bit. So I think we've got to be open, and we just got to start recruiting, and we've got to start recruiting different kind of people. Because otherwise that gulf is just going to get bigger and bigger.
Good stuff.
Then advertisers will wonder why we're not on the table. And it's because we don't understand potentially 50% of the country.
Absolutely. Steve, I'm just conscious of time. We can keep going until we've gone through these questions, but obviously I don't think this will cut off for us. But if it does, thank you for coming. But keep cracking on with the questions until we get through them. Lucy Crotty asked, 80s, 90s culture seemed to celebrate working class culture and mock the upper classes. In the noughties and the tens, culture seems to deride this audience as chavs and Brexiteers. What do you think about this shift, and how can we create narratives that reframe who this audience are?
No, I think that's definitely true. I think part of the problem, though, the only thing I would be a little bit careful is I think that 80s and 90s this audience started to shift into the cult of the individualism. So I think it started to break down that sense of kind of family and kind of community, and I think that probably caused kind of damage. But I think you're right. There's definitely much more kind of celebration. Definitely in youth culture, working class was always a big kind of hero in kind of youth culture. And we need to address that. We need to have the kind of new kind of heroes. We need to kind of celebrate that, and we need to move away from this thing that these people are gammon and thick and stupid, etc., and move away from these kind of stereotypes and show people in a positive kind of light. Sorry, Dave. Someone actually said to me, they said, you know, we're talking about banning all this content, but why have we still got Vicky Pollard on the TV?
Well, yeah. And there's a juicy one from David Burrows. Hello, David. Is the UK mass mainstream by definition only white? Is that C1, C2
right
demographic?
So, fantastic question. Really, really good question. For this presentation, I've done the layer through the white mass mainstream, and I did that deliberately because I wanted to understand how they felt, and I felt there'd be a lot more nuances that would pull it apart. In the future, I'd love to work with people to look at different elements of what makes the mainstream.
Good stuff. So the other part of David's question there was really around: are you seeing non-white mass mainstream as inherently different, or different nuance to it? So obviously, it sounds to me like that's a to be continued for future work.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the things I did pick up a little bit in some of the Facebook posts that I saw was actually in some areas you outside kind of London and non kind of strong ethnic areas, you sometimes get a black person who would be not supportive of BLM, and then suddenly everyone would post that post as like justification. So it'd be really interesting for me to explore how people from ethnic minorities feel when they're really in the outskirts of London in a small little village or town, and what the difference is and how people behave. I know we were talking about setting that up, weren't we, Dave?
Indeed. I think that's a really, really interesting space to look at. Okay, 2 more questions for you, and then you can have a proper drink. So we've got Sheila Tolley who's asking, are we at a genuine turning point due to COVID, or is this just a transient thing?
Brilliant question. Look, 2 things. I don't think culture's on ice age, yeah? So I don't think things are frozen before and they're just going to remain exactly the same. And I think some people, they said, well, you know, nothing's really going to change. You might get a little bit of a recession, but recessions change culture, yeah? The last recession brought in the rise of the populace and changed this audience kind of massively. But to answer your question, do I think all these trends would have happened before? Yes, I do. I think all COVID was a catalyst for stuff that was bubbling already.
Okay. And final question we've got to address today is, how much does this audience care about environmentalism? Is it more about respecting their local community and nature spots rather than reducing the carbon footprint?
I think subjects like carbon is probably too far for them. They're not really thinking about that. I think with this audience, you always have to put things into the context of their world. So you have to make it closer. If you want a good message, you have to make it closer. I thought the litter stuff was really interesting because I think there's something interesting there. And I'm seeing a change. I'm definitely seeing people appreciate things more. And I think some of that's through education from their kids. I think they're more connected with nature. They want to be more connected. So I think there's some positive kind of signs. Good. But what the future will hold, I don't know. There's a lot of work to be done. And I know we're in talks with a couple of people about doing some work around the mass kind of mainstream and environmentalism.
Great stuff. Steve, what's next then?
Probably the environment and mass mainstream. I want to also do something about strugglers, those are kind of who are kind of at the bottom of so-called kind of society, and then I want to do some work on disability as well. So three things in the pipeline.
Excellent. And how pessimistic, how optimistic are you about the future? I like to ask you that at the end of the.
I'm an optimist, so I'm very optimistic. But
I might hear you say not very one day, and that's when I know.
Yeah, but I think there's some things that need to, well, big issues that really need to be thought about.
Okay. Fabulous, guys. Have a look at the videos. Steve will follow up with the presentation deck to everyone as well. It's been a pleasure to be involved with this, Steve, and
thanks very much. Thanks, Dave.
You've clearly engaged a lot of people in a really powerful way. Some great questions at the end. So thanks to everybody who's joined us.
Thanks very much.
All right. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.